APIA Nevada is a grassroots nonprofit organization that advocates for policies empowering everyday Asian Pacific Islander Nevadans. Nevada is home to a growing APIA community, accounting for 1 in 10 voters. We are One APIA Nevada. Concili Incorporated is Nevada's premier Democratic campaign firm, fighting for progressive issues and candidates for over a decade, and proud sponsor of Battle-Born Progress.
This episode of Out in Front brought to you by
Concili Inc., Nevada State Education Association, One APIA Nevada, Silver State Voices, and Stefan and Marta Schmidt, as well as our episode sponsors, Save Lives Nevada and Washoe Education Association.
Institute teacher / host for Out in Front today. Thank you for joining us. Annette is off this week and next week. She is taking a well-deserved and well-earned vacation. And we hope she is, 1, not watching because you're supposed to be off, boss. 2, having a great time, and we'll see her in a few weeks. Every time I do this, I feel like I am the substitute teacher coming in with the TV cart saying, all right, I'm going to pop in a video and let's just have some fun while the teacher is out. So Annette, the boss / the real host and teacher of this, is out, but we will see her when she is back from her travels. We're very excited. She's taking a well-earned rest. And we are going to talk about a subject that is also super calm and super chill and nothing to worry about. It's not like you haven't seen it in the news all the time. And it's inflation, all things inflation. And we aren't going to have pundits on, except sometimes us at BBP, especially our comms director, Will, who is on with us tonight, has some awesome hot takes. But we're actually going to be talking with our favorite economist here at BBP and professor of economics and all things money, Dr. Elliot Parker. He is going to be joining us today and going to be teaching us and telling us what is inflation really, who's really at fault. Do we really have President Joe Biden up there on the pole changing gas prices every single morning at 3 a.m.? Or is it a little bit more, is there a little bit more explanation to that than what you may see on the news or on some political commercials? So we're going to kick it right off with the expert, Dr. Elliot Parker from the University of Nevada, Reno, actual professor, actual professional. Welcome back. We are very excited. My first question for you, and you're also going
Thank you for having me.
A little bit. Thank you. Welcome back. We're very excited. And I wanted to start off and have you teach us a little bit what the heck is inflation and how does it actually work? So take it away. Teach us some stuff.
Well, if you remember the old song, Alice's Restaurant, there's a character on there called Officer Opie, and it's very important to him that he gets his photographs with the pictures and arrows, the circles and arrows, and a paragraph on the back of each one on there. How many of you have heard that song before? I'm dating myself. None of you. Okay, well, try it sometime. Arlo Guthrie, Alice's Restaurant. It was an anti-war song from the late 60s. So here's my pictures with circles and arrows. I'm going to start with a presentation. Give me just 1 second to get it going. Okay, so what we're talking about for the next 30 minutes or so is inflation 2022. There's a lot of nonsense going around in the press, especially in right-wing media and various political candidates who think they know what's going on and really have no clue. So let's start with what that looks like in terms of just looking at numbers. I'm an economist. I love looking at numbers. And so this is looking at the month-to-month variation in inflation rates. And of course, what you see here is that there's a lot of variation. So the way we prefer to look at it is sort of over the last 12 months. And so you can see, for example, that the consumer price index is up 8.6% over the last 12 months. And that's a lot, right, compared to what we've been seeing over the last decade. The biggest part of that is energy prices, gasoline, oil, right? 35% has gone up over the last 12 months. Food has gone up, more so for food eaten in the house as opposed to restaurant food, but nonetheless about 10%. And everything else is averaging about 6%. But even that average disguises a lot. There's three big other products that have really increased in price. Airline fares, if you've flown recently, you know this, they're up about 38% over the last year. Used cars, weirdly enough, up 16%. But that's being driven by new cars, and they're up about 13% on average. Now let's take a little bit longer view of consumer price inflation. And you can see the rate of inflation was much higher back in the 1970s. And then it came down in the 1980s, and it's been relatively stable since. It wiggles a little bit, but generally the Federal Reserve is aiming for an inflation rate of about 2 to 3%. And there's good months and bad months. You can see during the Great Recession, it actually went negative. Right, that's what we call deflation. But nonetheless, what we see in the last year and a half is relatively high, and people will go back and say, well, gosh, this looks like the 70s again. So let's start with your basic economic theory. What causes price inflation, right? Price inflation is where prices go up. That's pretty obvious. But it comes from two basic categories. One is a decrease in supply in the overall economy, and the other is an increase in demand in the overall economy. So what kind of things decrease supply? Well, the pandemic, right, had a huge effect. A lot of people lost their jobs, and for some of them, it was difficult to get back into the job market. Some had to deal with childcare, for example. There was at least a year and a half or so where it was difficult being able to raise your kids because kids were not always back in the classroom. And some people had difficulty getting back in the workforce. Some people just simply retired. The next big thing, this is something that I know my wife has spent a lot of time working on, is various broken supply chains that we had. And I'll explain that in a little bit. Reduced immigration, nobody talks about this, but with the pandemic and with the anti-immigrant policies of the prior administration, we have roughly 2 million fewer immigrants than we would have based on normal projections. And those immigrants affect things like harvesting crops in California and building houses when you use immigrant labor in construction teams. There's also an aging workforce. The baby boom has started to hit retirement years. And a lot of people took the pandemic as a nice sign of the times for them to drop out of the workforce. There's other people who decided that now's a good time to start their own business. And so they haven't entered into the workforce as an employee. They've been working, but they've been working running their own small business. And finally, the big one, global oil markets. And I use that word carefully, global, because we focus often on what's happening in the United States. But the truth is what's happening is a worldwide phenomenon. And I talked about that a little bit in my last presentation, but I'll show you a few different things this time. So what increased demand? Well, back in 2020, I don't know if you remember the pandemic, right? It's just things happen so fast, we're all forgetting. But we all stayed home. We stopped spending money. And the result of that is savings went up. And so we started spending that money in 2021. 2020 was a time of very low inflation. So 2021 basically was making up for the reduced inflation because we were spending less by we were now doubling up and spending a lot more. The second thing is an increase in money supply. I'm going to talk about this next. The Federal Reserve Bank in 2020 increased the money supply to try to accommodate all this savings that was going on by households, and they wanted to make sure the market stayed liquid. That means that people were still able to borrow and lend and pay back debt, et cetera, that they didn't have a freeze up like they had back in 2008. There was the CARES Act of 2020 and a few small acts that, bills that passed after that in late 2020. And then in early 2021, there was the American Rescue Plan Act. Finally, the other increase in demand is that it's created these tight labor markets, and workers have decided that since they haven't gotten pay increases in a decade or more, that we're keeping up with inflation, now is a good time to start asking for higher pay. And we started seeing some increase in wages. So let's start with the big one. And this is the one that people will try to blame on the president, right? Too much money. The government's just printing money somehow, and that's making this all work. Well, first of all, the president doesn't manage the money supply. This is done by the Federal Reserve System, right? This is our central bank. They manage the money supply. President doesn't have a lot to do with it, though presidents can apply political pressure, especially when you have a Fed chairman who's coming up for reappointment. Sometimes the president might lean on them, and sometimes the governors might respond to that pressure. But what really happened is in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve Board intervened massively. Right now, what was happening in March 2020? That's when the economy shut down, right? That's when unemployment jumped up. Everybody's laying off their workers, and a lot of people are really worried about keeping their jobs. The Fed wanted to make sure that firms didn't freeze up. The Fed also wanted to make sure that people had enough money to take their income and save it because they weren't able to spend it. And so they first engaged in something called repo operations. And this is really technical stuff, but basically what happens is the Fed goes out to the banks and says, hey, we want to buy temporarily some of your treasury bonds, and then they will re-exchange them later. So basically the Fed buys treasury bonds with new money. And that was $2 trillion worth of new money that they injected at that point. They also dropped the federal funds rate. It was roughly about 1.75%, and they dropped it virtually down to zero so that banks could borrow from each other for no price whatsoever. Now, economists will tell you that if the money supply grows faster than money demand, price inflation is going to happen. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. It'll happen eventually. So then in 2021, the Fed started tapering off. And now, in the last several months, the Fed has started to raise rates as a way to try to really start slowing the economy down because they're worried about inflation. We're going to get to that. So this is a graph of how the U.S. money supply changed, right? The purple line represents what we call M2, which is basically not just the cash that people have, but their checking and their savings accounts, right? All the money they have access to. And you can see there's a huge jump up in total deposits. Now, the blue line is currency per capita, and that jumped up, but nowhere near as much as a percentage. What that's telling you is really what was happening is a big jump up in deposits. Why? Because Americans couldn't spend their money, and so they started saving it instead. Now, interestingly enough, when did President Biden take office again? I don't think he was in office in 2020, right? So if you want to focus on the idea that more money leads to more inflation, when did that growth happen? It didn't happen under President Biden, right? It's just that we're now paying the costs, right? We're having the repercussions from something that happened back in March of 2020. And this, of course, is all about the pandemic. So what's the problem with inflation, right? Why is it a problem? Well, in general, economists have decided, and the Federal Reserve Board agrees, that generally a little inflation is a good thing, right? It helps grease the economy to some extent, makes it possible to change prices a little bit easier and adjust relative wages, et cetera. We've also learned that deflation, where prices go down on average, is a really bad thing. It creates a lot of problems. And so basically aiming for 2 to 3% is the target where we think the economy is going to operate best. But inflation, especially if it starts getting above 2 to 3%, makes it hard. It makes it really hard for people with lower incomes, right? Because their wages are usually the last to adjust. And they're often the people who really don't have much savings. They're living month to month. And so when grocery store prices go up, it really makes it hard for them to feed their kids, so to speak. It also affects retirees who have fixed incomes. Economists also don't like higher inflation because it leads to really bad investment choices. It leads people to do basically stupid things. So one of the real problems with inflation is that it can become what we call embedded, right? And what we mean by that is people start to expect high inflation to continue. And once that happens, then inflation causes inflation, which causes more inflation, and it can keep going on. This is essentially what happened in the 1970s. So that raises the question, is this the 1970s all over again, right? And this is a little technical, but what I want to say is that back in the early 70s, actually in the 50s and 60s and ending in 72, the US was the center of a worldwide fixed exchange rate system where the job of the Federal Reserve was to keep interest rates stable. And that was really important because every other major economy in the world fixed their currencies against the US dollar. And that system broke down, right? August 15th, 1971, under President Nixon. And the Federal Reserve did not figure out that they had to come up with a new policy until President Carter. And so what you spent then was several years where the Federal Reserve responded to inflation by increasing the money supply to try to get interest rates down, which led to more inflation. And no wonder it got out of control in the 1970s. By the way, Kate's home, so she might come over and photobomb you in a few minutes. So, but not right now. Anyways, my point is this isn't what the Federal Reserve is doing now, right? The Federal Reserve is not responding to inflation by trying to get interest rates down, right? And cause more inflation. The Federal Reserve is doing the opposite. And the point is, this is not the 1970s, right? Completely different environment in the 1970s. So anybody who tells you, oh, this is the 1970s, doesn't know what they're talking about. So next reason people will give you, well, there's just too much government spending. And, you know, first of all, government spending comes from somewhere, right? They have to get it from somewhere. So if the government spends more than it receives in taxes, it basically has to borrow it. And the way the government, our government does it, there she is, is to issue treasury bonds, right? The equivalent of savings bonds. And so people lend the government money by buying their bonds and they use it as an investment vehicle. And it works, right? But the money that is being spent is not being created. The money comes from people who have savings that they don't want to spend at that moment. So in a dysfunctional economy, and we are not this economy, right? I'm talking South American economies under tin pot dictators. The government basically borrows new money by borrowing it from the central bank. And so in that case, excess spending always leads to excess money, which always leads to inflation, right? In the US, the government borrows from the public and the central bank is independent, right? The Treasury cannot tell the Federal Reserve, hey, print money to buy our bonds. It does not happen in the United States. It's not the way it works. So now in terms of spending, temporary borrowing in order to spend during bad times is a really good idea, right? During, I don't know, a pandemic, when people have lost their jobs, you're worried about whether people can make the rent or they can buy groceries, right? Then in that case, intervening really makes a lot of sense and keeps the economy from spiraling downwards. But this is when the private sector is not spending, right? So public sector needs to step up when the private sector is down. On the other hand, excessive borrowing during good times is not a good policy, right? And this is what people are worried about. And of course, the politics of this is Republicans will cut taxes as a way to try to force government to spend less. That will create deficits, and then they'll complain that we are borrowing during good times. You know, whereas we should be paying more taxes during good times in order to pay down some of that debt. So looking at the budget deficit, right? This is the monthly federal budget deficit going back to 1980. And the US government spends less, right? Compared to other developed economies, we spend less. Our government spends less, but we receive much less in tax revenue. So we tend to run bigger budget deficits. This is a problem, right? And we need to deal with this. And really the only way to deal with this is to start, making the wealthy pay more taxes, in my opinion. Budget surpluses in the late 90s, right, turned into deficits under Bush. And there were bigger deficits in the Great Recession. But the 2020 deficit under Trump was off the charts, right? And you can see now these deficits are coming back down. We're back into, some months we're back into surplus, right? So it's getting back to normal. But of course, that was a huge deficit that we saw during the Trump administration, the latter part of the Trump administration. And it's driven by primarily the pandemic and government policy thereof. So here's a look at how much Americans spent, and this is per capita, that is per person, adjusted for inflation, on services, that's the blue line, on goods, that's the purple line, and then their total disposable personal income, which includes things like unemployment benefits, is the red line. And the difference between the red line and the purple line is how much people are saving. So you see a big jump up in savings that happened in 2020, in spite of the fact that personal income went down, right? So what did that do? It led to a lot of savings, right? There's a lot of extra spending right there that led to people saving more. And you can see it happen twice, but notice when it happened the first time, right? It happened in 2020. Who was president then? It wasn't President Biden. So it was temporary. So the people who say, look, this is a temporary effect on inflation. There's too much spending, right? This was a temporary effect. We should expect, because the spending is not continuing at the same rate, that it'll settle down. And so this increased inflation should be temporary as well. Note that there was, however, a big shift from services, the blue line, to goods, right? Things that we might buy off Amazon and get shipped to us because we're not out eating and traveling the same way we were. And so that's a huge change right there. It may not look as much on these pretty lines that I've created for you, but it's really big. Now notice when Biden took office, right? It's not when the big change happened, right? There is the American Rescue Plan Act here, but the CARES Act right here and the other acts right there were a huge part of it. But of course, Republicans don't want to take any responsibility for that. They had nothing to do with it. So what's driving inflation now? Well, the biggest part is gas prices. You all know this. And I put Washoe County up here, even though I know most of you are from Clark County, because Washoe has some of the highest gas prices in the entire country. Now, we're a little less than California in general, but if you can see from this graph that Clark County has much cheaper gas prices than Washoe, and basically the entire West has much more expensive gas prices than the Southwest. Now, Kate and I drove this yellow line about 2 weeks ago, right? Drove from Reno, basically almost followed the straight line through all the states. So I can attest that there's huge differences in gas prices. See, Kate?
Make corporations pay their fair share. I'll take care of everything.
Editorial comments. So could it be worse? Yeah, right. Other developed countries, especially those in Western Europe, pay a lot more for gas than we do. Americans generally have been spoiled on cheap gas. And I focus on gas, but I'm going to switch to oil because oil and gas prices are highly correlated, like 98% correlation. Adjusting for inflation, gas prices, interestingly enough, were higher back in 2008. So we talk about how high they are, but if we adjust for inflation during that time, inflation of other goods, we see, in fact, that the high gas prices that we've been facing are not the highest we faced. U.S. accounted for about half of the entire world's increase in oil production over the last decade. And this increase in oil production helped to drive prices down. The other thing that drove prices down was Saudi Arabia was getting tired of American producers producing so much. And so they tried to drive prices down too, to drive them out of business. many oil producers lost money. I know I'm not fond of oil companies. I'm not defending them, but in something like 7 of the last 10 years before the pandemic, the oil industry in general was losing money. Now, not necessarily the big players like Exxon, but the smaller players. So if you can't really understand oil prices unless you understand what happened to oil prices in April of 2020, in West Texas crude briefly went negative, right? That is, oil companies were paying people to take oil off their hands because they had nowhere to put all the oil. Now, interesting enough, the date that happened was 4/20, right? So you could argue maybe some people were smoking a little too much weed that day and got the negative sign on the price a little mixed up. But nonetheless, it really did happen. And the point is that there was so much oil, they had nowhere to put it. Many producers were shutting down their wells. Others were going out of business. Now, is this expected to be permanent? No, right? We're still dealing with the pandemic. And then we had Ukraine, right? Just as we start thinking things are settling down, we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Between February 24th, when the invasion took place, and June 10th, crude oil prices rose by 1/3, right? And US gas prices rose on average by 35%. Now it's come down a bit. I was just looking at average gas prices in the country, and they're down about 1/4. That is 25 cents over the last 2 weeks, which means that Kate and I chose the really wrong time to drive across the country. But the other piece people don't recognize, like we were all busy back in March and April of 2020, right? And nobody remembers this. But notice this headline from the New York Times: oil nations prodded by Trump reach deal to slash production, right? Basically a drop of 9.7 billion barrels per day, 9.7 million barrels per day, I'm sorry. And that winds up being almost 10% of world oil production. And they said that's not even enough. Now, how did Trump get this arrangement, given that most of the time presidents would not do this? This is something very unusual. He more or less told Saudi Arabia that future American defense spending and military aid would be tied to what they did. And why? Because he was worried that oil companies were losing too much money, and he wanted to try to prop up US oil companies. If you don't believe me, go look it up, okay? This really happened, and everybody seems to have amnesia. That was 2 years ago. And so what happened then, if you look, this is a graph from the Energy Information Administration. You can see that for a brief period, you saw this big drop in world production. Of course, that's pushed by a big drop in world consumption because people weren't driving. And that led to accumulation of oil. So then as consumption recovers, right, and production starts to recover, you start using up that oil. And so basically we were consuming more than we were producing for about 1.5 years. And some of it was to draw down those reserves. But then what we find roughly around first quarter 2022 is we're more or less back to equality between supply and demand. And then Russia invades Ukraine. Now, when did Biden take office? Right about there. Right. So this whole big picture right here, this did not take place under President Biden. And blaming President Biden for the big drop off in oil production, right, is a little misleading at best. So here's a really hard to read graph. Okay, so this is testing your graph reading as much as you can. What I'm trying to show is basically for the United States in blue, Russia and the other related areas in what we call the CIS, Saudi Arabia in orange, the other Middle East and Northern African countries in yellow, China, and then in purple, Canada and Mexico, South America, Africa, and then the entire rest of the world. This goes back all the way to 1973. You can see a big drop that happened between 73 and 75. And this was the OPEC oil embargo. It created a worldwide recession at the time. And then you can see another big drop that happened between 1979 and 1983. This is basically Iran and the revolution. And Iran got pulled out of the world oil market, and they weren't producing very much. And so big drop off and a huge increase in prices. I'll show you in a minute. But look at the drop that happened in April of 2020, right? In terms of production. Have you ever seen anything like that, right? Going back to 1973, there is no other event like this. So that big drop off in oil production, which was caused by the pandemic and by President Trump making that deal with OPEC to cut production, that was huge. So what about prices? Well, I'm taking oil prices here. These are the Brent prices from the North Sea, and I'm adjusting them for inflation. You can see, for example, right in here, oops, what just happened? There you go. Sorry. Right in here, you can see the big jump up that happened with the OPEC oil crisis. Then you can see the jump up that happened with the Iranian Revolution, right? And then oil prices fell for most of the 80s and 90s. And then this is 2008, and this is 2010, right? So each of these times we had a recession. Each of these times oil prices rose so high, we had a recession. And so here we are right here. Oil prices are not as high, but we still see the same kind of shock to oil prices that we've seen in the past. So this is that same graph, but just looking at the different areas. You can see there's a huge drop in the Middle East. You can see a big drop in Saudi Arabia. You can see US production dropped significantly, but the rest of the world also dropped, right? So for example, the US is down 9%, 2021 over 2019. Saudi Arabia is down. The other rest of the Middle East is still down. Africa fell by 19%. Nigeria still has not recovered. Venezuela's production is down. Colombia, the United Kingdom, right? North Sea oil, Norway, Angola. These countries have significantly dropped their production and it hasn't recovered yet. And then one of the things in the United States making it hard to recover is their shortages of labor. The people who, oil field work is hard work to do new drilling, and they're having a hard time getting workers. They also can't get fracking sand. And so it's very, they have shortages like the rest of us are dealing with. And when did Biden take office? Right? Right there. So then supply chain bottlenecks. Our economy is very globally integrated, and many products, the supply chain has become really complicated. It crosses borders many times. Firms cut costs to maximize their short-run profits, and they pay their shareholders, but sometimes managers don't have incentives to focus on the long term. There's something that many companies have been using called just-in-time inventory management, which is great as long as everything goes right. But when anything goes wrong, it sucks, right? Because that means that basically all of a sudden you don't have any inventories to back you up if there's any problems. The pandemic had a huge effect on supply chains, right? It disrupted production and transportation. There was a big shift in demand. You guys remember toilet paper, right? I mean, all of a sudden people wanted to buy consumer household toilet paper, and producers weren't making that kind of toilet paper. They're making toilet paper for businesses. And so all of a sudden we can't find toilet paper anymore, right? Those kind of disruptions were happening everywhere, and firms don't find it profitable to make big changes for temporary events, right? They'd rather just wait it out. And one of the problems that comes out of this is when you have concentrated markets, like recently the baby formula market, you've got a small number of companies producing a product, and one company like Abbott shuts down their plant. All of a sudden, we have a nationwide shortage of baby food formula. One firm's problems become a problem for us all because of excessive concentration. And all these goods that people were buying, right? All these products that we were buying, a lot of them were coming from overseas. And so what we saw is containers, right? All of us rose by 10 times to rent a container for international shipping. And some of that was made even more difficult because the Chinese had made a lot of masks, sent them around the world, and those masks had been delivered and the containers were sitting empty all around the world. And so you had to gather up those containers, and that's one of the reasons that made this shortage even worse. Now, these prices are now coming down. I just looked up a graph. It's a global market, right? So it's not just us, but I looked up a graph, and this is more or less what it looks like as of up until the 23rd of June. So you can see that container prices are coming back down. So then there's planes, trains, and automobiles, right? Planes are huge. 96% drop in passenger miles because people weren't flying. Planes were removed from service. Remember the 737 MAX that stopped flying, right? And a lot of these planes got grounded. 777s were dropped. Jet fuel is a huge part of the cost of planes. And then also many planes are being used to ship air freight instead of passengers. And then on top of it, you got labor shortages, pilot shortages, stewardess shortages, mechanic shortages. And they have great difficulty right now. So if you've flown anytime recently, it's a nightmare. Now, trains have been relatively stable, right? In the US, it's mostly freight. Passengers really are not a big deal except in the East Coast corridors. Future disruptions could happen in trains, and that's something we got to keep our eye on. And then automobiles, right? What we find is that there are something like 3,000 semiconductor chips in the typical automobile now. And we weren't producing enough. We were getting them from the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and they had high demand for things like iPhones, right, and other uses. And so automobiles only made up 5% of the market, and so they weren't focusing on it. But the automobile market, we found that our producers were producing automobiles that they couldn't sell because they couldn't get all the parts they needed. So they just sat there idle. And then, of course, all this stuff going on. Interest rates are going up, inflation's picking up, growth is slowing, right? And then Wall Street responds completely rationally, as we know they would, right? And calm and objectively scoping out exactly what they predicted would happen, right? And of course, it sets off a mass panic. So since Russia invaded Ukraine, the Standard & Poor's stock index has fallen by about 15%. It's about 19% if we adjust for inflation. And so we were afraid of inflation, and now we're afraid of recession, and we also were afraid of interest rates rising, like we couldn't somehow see that coming. But if we take a longer view of the stock market, right, we see that in general, the trend is not downwards, right? Since 1980, even adjusted for inflation, stock prices have tended to do very well over the long term, but there is some variation. Stock market's driven by a lot of things, right? Falling interest rates, expectations, rising corporate earnings growth, falling corporate tax rates, under the Trump administration, recession worries, and speculation, right? Lots and lots of speculation. Everybody's trying to figure out how to take advantage of everybody else in the stock market by getting there first. So now I'm getting close to wrapping up. I'm sorry if it's, I don't have my clock right in front, but I think I'm running a few minutes over. What worries economists? Generally, as I mentioned before, economists worry about inflationary expectations becoming embedded. Because our experience has shown us that it's almost impossible to get rid of inflationary expectations without causing a recession. This process of disinflation results in high interest rates, right? The Fed's tightening up on money, and that typically causes a recession, which can either be deep or long. And so that's what we don't want to have. And I think we can safely say that recession is worse than inflation, right? It's easier to buy expensive things if you have a job. It's hard to buy cheap things if you don't have a job. But with tight labor markets right now, the Fed's walking a tightrope. They're trying to make sure inflationary expectations stay down. They're trying to slow the rate of growth of money, but they don't want to cause a recession. So we're kind of in a precarious situation right now. So this is just a graph of economic growth, right? GDP grew 5.5% in 2021, which is the fastest growth rate we've seen since 1984, right? But we're still behind where we would have been had we not had the pandemic and the recession it caused. Consumption spending per capita rose 7.7%. That is the fastest growth we have seen since 1946 when we were coming out of World War II. And this is significantly above trend, and this is part of what's causing it. So I think I got two more slides. My point here is to say that the market really doesn't expect inflation to continue. Consumers do, right? Consumers currently are expecting higher inflation for the next year or so. But investors, people who are putting their money on the line, we can figure out what they think based on what assets they buy and whether it's protected from inflation or not. And what we find is generally they're expecting maybe 2.6% inflation over the next 2 years per year. And then after that, returning back down to 2%. So consumers say inflation will stay high. Investors don't. Investors have been a lot more accurate over the last 20, 30 years. And so the point here is stay calm, right? Quit letting this freak you out, and don't let all of the political ads that are going to come out freak you out. So New York Post did this headline not long ago, right? Biden isn't fooling anyone. Inflation is his fault. He has no solution to fix it, right? H.L. Mencken said, for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And basically, the New York Post and anybody else who says something like this hasn't looked at the data. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't understand inflation. They are simply clearly wrong. And I will end there.
That was amazing. Thank you, Dr. I feel like I want to say thank you, Professor. I was watching the chats. People are incredibly thankful for this presentation. I think we've had a lot of people even say they are taking notes, or they're going to go back to this, or they want this in Spanish to like show their family. I was saying we've been giving people like an economics class for free in mass. So my first question is, how do you were showing us here in the last slide how at least the New York Post is talking about it. How do you feel when you watch the news or you watch those political commercials? In general, is that freak out happening that people are having because of the way that the media is covering it? And how can we help address that? How can we help fix that?
The cost of this are real to people. Okay, so imagine you're, a working class woman who is, has an older car that doesn't get great gas mileage. And because housing prices, say, are expensive, you live, 20, 30 miles away. In Reno, I could imagine you're living in Fallon, right? Or somewhere like that. You got to drive to work. And all of a sudden, gas prices are really high. And, you don't have a college education in economics, and you don't know what causes it. You just know that it's happening. And so you want to blame someone, right? So you want to blame the guy in charge. You don't want to blame the guy that was in charge 2 years ago because you don't understand how that links up, right? You don't see how what happened in the pandemic links up to gas prices. So you're looking for somebody to blame. And it is a natural thing. But add to that, you have, of course, many reporters who haven't had economics classes and haven't examined the data or the historical events. You also have political opportunists, right? So what they want to do is basically try to find some sort of message that'll resonate so they can win elections. And it's one thing to try to get facts out there for people and say, here's what's going on. It's another thing to just simply make shit up, right? And try to convince people, that they should elect you because somehow it's somebody else's fault. And you can just, you don't understand it, but you know that it upsets people. So let's go get people upset. So is there something real there? Absolutely. Right. But is there something where you can say, oh, this is a simple cause? I mean, if there were a simple cause, it's this, right? Pandemic, Ukraine. Pandemic, Ukraine, right? And, the rest is noise.
Absolutely. That is the best explanation that I've heard. I feel like when you said stay calm, I feel like we should have the signs that the English had, keep calm and keep going.
Oh yeah, right.
You should have those for this.
It could be worse. And another way to think about this in terms of the Ukraine part, right? Because that burst of inflation that we saw, that was tapering off, right? And had there not been the invasion of Ukraine, we wouldn't be talking about inflation right now, right? Things were settling down. It was a burst in 2021, coming in part because 2020 was depressed, right? And so it was a recovery from that. So as Americans, is it worth it to us, right, to try to take a stand against Russia? Is it worth it to us to try to basically stop buying Russian oil, even if it means higher oil prices? I think for most Americans, it's worth it, right? But I understand, right, if you're living month to month, people are asking you to take on a cost, and they're not even giving you a uniform, so maybe we all should just, get drafted into the Freedom Army, and let's go out and say, stand for democracy and freedom.
That's right. Now I'm going to blame everything on Putin.
Well, there at least you got somebody who did something,
Right.
He invaded Ukraine. Now we responded in a way that he did not expect. Right? We responded basically by saying, well, we're going to stop. We're not going to let you have what you want. But that comes at cost to us.
Definitely. Definitely does. Speaking of media, I want to go to Will, who is not a reporter, but he talks to them all the time, every day. It's his job as our communications director. Will, what change have you seen in the frequency that the media has been talking about inflation, and what's the narrative around it in the last few months?
Yeah, thanks, Maria. I have been crunching some numbers since last night when I was preparing to be on the program, just looking at statistics and stories about media reporting on this issue. And from what I've seen, the most basic search I did was just to see what is the recurrence of inflation as a topic in the news. And from what I've seen in the past year, since about August of last year, the mentions of inflation in headlines or news sources has pretty much quadrupled in the past year. People are talking about this issue more on social media as well. There's a very similar trend there. And a lot of the recent polling suggests that inflation is the top, or one of the top, if not the top issue for many voters that they're paying attention to. I think a big reason for that is, like Elliot stated, that this is a real issue for people that are in the working class. Many of them may be still recovering or reeling from the effects of the pandemic, whether they lost a job or a house or had to move or take on other burdens. And that effect is real. But what's happening is also, as Elliot described, is media agencies latching onto this issue and reporting it in a way that, while maybe not strictly unfactual in the case of many mainstream sources, are probably creating sort of links in people's mind between the Biden administration, things that he's done, and the issue of inflation. And seeing the line on the graph go up, and Biden, you make speeches about it, but people continuing to have this anxiety, and that kind of fuels this feedback loop where people are freaked out about it. They want something done about it, don't really know who to blame, don't really necessarily understand it. But what's fascinating on the right wing is that they are working overtime to really construct and present a narrative to the voting public that ties Biden's executive actions or his legislative achievements with the American Rescue Plan or the bipartisan infrastructure bill with the continuing inflation. But as Elliot's presentation kind of pointed out, that as the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, as the economy kind of settles down from the shock of the pandemic, we're kind of starting to just see the turning of the corner, albeit, barring any more explosive developments in Europe. But I think it's really interesting to see that, the right wing is very diligent about trying to construct this narrative and throw everything at the wall. Just going through Media Matters reports, which I follow pretty regularly, on the issue of inflation. There's examples of pundits on Fox saying that the string of mass shootings that are happening are just like a government false flag to distract from inflation. There's Charlie Kirk of the Talking Points, or not Talking Points, Toilet Paper USA, whatever their group is called, that saying that transgender people are responsible for inflation because of reasons that I don't want to even bother elucidating. And then there's people like Tucker Carlson who are saying that Biden is purposely making the price of gas go up so that he can enact his Green New Deal socialism or whatever. So they're trying to basically take a bunch of their familiar talking points and try to stick the inflation issue onto it, because they're counting on the phenomena that Elliot described of people kind of looking for someone to blame. And so if they can redirect or sort of create a little dam in the river to redirect some of that outrage towards Biden on the economy, because they understand that this is such a impactful issue for a lot of working class people, it's their way to try to siphon off those votes and take advantage of that sentiment. So that's kind of like the bigger landscape that we're seeing on the media end of things, and whether people's preferred solution to fixing inflation is reflected in polling or not. The fact of the matter is, it is an issue that is top of mind for voters pretty much across the country in this election.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will. Yeah, it seems like every time there's something serious happening, a lot of the right-wing pundits, you even hear them on CNN, but what people really want to talk about is inflation and the economy and how Biden has screwed it all up. And they always try to get that talking point in there. So, Dr. Parker, I want to go back to you, and this is my last question before I go into audience questions, because we have a lot of good ones. I want to, really bring back how you, throughout the graphs that you were showing, and you just talked to us about how international war or big events impact them by impacting the economy. How have other world events impacted the market, so that we can continue to sort of keep that mindset of, sure, it's bad, but keep calm, because this is not the first time. This is, something that tends to happen.
Well, it is an unusual confluence of events. The pandemic, the last time we had something like that happen was over 100 years ago, right? And what's different this time is last time we didn't do anything about it. And while the U.S. death toll was high, the worldwide death toll was catastrophic. So it was very different. So, who was it? Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so, that was not in our experience. And so the pandemic was a huge event, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that it has repercussions that last for several years, right? So I don't want to dismiss that as saying, oh, that happens all the time. We have seen several times big jumps in oil prices, and in the past, they have been related to recessions. Now, in the past, we used a lot more oil than we use now relative to our overall GDP. So I don't think a recession is inevitable as a result of higher oil prices, at least not a deep one. I think it is possible we'll have a shallow one. The bigger worry is that once those inflation expectations start getting out there, the Fed is going to react to try to dampen them. And that's the worry about rising interest rates causing this. And we've seen that happen numerous times, right? I mean, it happened, and it set off the financial crisis back in 2008, right? We saw it happen, over and over again. Like, probably, 40 times, we've seen it happen since World War II in terms of just having the impact on declining spending. However, maybe 40 is too much. Since World War II, that's too high of a number. I was thinking more like since World War One. Sorry, I'm getting photobombed. Hi,
Lieutenant Governor.
I think that, your elected officials should be doing everything they can to lower prices for folks that are having a hard time and who didn't cause these higher prices. You can do things like lower the sales tax, which is regressive anyway. You can do things like make sure that businesses don't have to pay any licensing fees to start up a new business. No licensing fees the first year, okay? Or the first 2 years. You can do things to help people. How about for our kids at school? No fees. Pay the tuition without fees. For crying out loud, it would lower the cost by half. Do things to help people who are trying to get through this. And I think that, our elected leaders should try to do that right now. Not long-term, short-term. How about through Christmas? How about through Christmas? When you're trying to get your kids gifts, when you're trying to get your kids school supplies at the end of the summer, how about through Christmas? Just give people a little bit of breathing room who have had to basically suck it up for the last 2 years, and now you're asking them to give some more.
I think.
What do you think?
I think I can't really add anything to that.
He has to say nice things.
You're right. You're right, Kate.
I can't quite remember your question, but okay. I think that was probably a better answer than what I would have given anyway.
That was amazing. By the way, everyone in the chat is saying, oh my God, that was the best advice we've ever gotten from a former lieutenant governor or from anyone. That was fantastic. That is absolutely correct. And I wanted to go, that actually reminds me of something that a lot of folks were putting in the chat, was about, what about canceling student debt? How can what help would that bring to or what solutions would that bring to our economic issues? And if so, how can we put pressure on the administration to do that? I don't know if there's someone that works in the White House in that household. I'm just kidding.
Part of that I want to punt, but part of that I just do want to address something. So I was lucky enough to go to college starting in the late 70s and early 80s. And it was in Texas, and they had oil money. And basically I remember paying $173, for a semester's worth of tuition, and another 100 and something, 150 for books. Imagine that, right? So the idea that you could go to a public school, good public university, and be able to afford it, right? I could work at something close to minimum wage and still be able to pay, I didn't have a house, but I had an apartment with several roommates, and I was able to make it. I didn't have any savings, but I was able to pay tuition and all the rest. I think that's an opportunity that we have, taken away from our young people. And partly because state legislatures have been more or less shifting the cost away from the taxpayer to the student. Now, that's a different matter than dealing with people who decide to go to elite private universities and make a choice, that is, that they go to good universities, right, where they're going to make better pay. And they make a choice knowing it. Now, on the other hand, there are people who have taken out loans, for these little private, not the elite private schools, but sort of the for-profit schools, who have basically been lied to and ripped off. Right? And those are real concerns, right? And really, as a public policy matter, making that fair. Now, in the short run, I'm not the right person to do this. This is not what I'm talking about, but I'm just giving my opinion. The worry, of course, I could imagine is that when you cancel debt, does that mean all future debt has to be canceled, right? Is it a one-time deal or is it a permanent deal? I would much rather let us come up with a new permanent arrangement, right? And then we can deal with the people who have accumulated that debt. But and I'm not speaking for the administration. And Kate, I don't know if she's going to touch this with a 10-foot pole because the administration hasn't come out with its policy on this. But But I do think we need to think about a longer term strategy to try to make it easier for people to have the same advantages that I had or that she had in going to a good public university, in having it be affordable. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but
I think it does. I think you just brought up, that really the root cause is the cost, right? A lot of people say that sort of the cost is, because if you think about it, I remember when I was in school, it just seemed like these loan companies are taking advantage of the fact that costs are rising, books are rising, and so they lure you into the loans. So if you deal with the root issue, that makes a lot of sense.
Right. And many young people don't know any better. They don't, their parents tell them, hey, go to school. It doesn't matter what you major in, and all the rest. And it's hard. You haven't yet developed the thinking about, well, okay, what difference will this make and how much will this cost? And again, those for-profit universities, they basically, many of them made their living by fooling people into taking out huge loans.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. The other big issue that is affecting a lot of people, especially here in Nevada, is housing. And how have you seen housing contributing to inflation? And what are some sort of words of advice around there?
Well, oddly enough, I might even have some graphs on that if you're game.
For sure, people loved your graphs. Not kidding.
Let me see if I can find it. Hang on just a second. Come on. Share screen there. Okay, so now I need to find the right slide. I have some graphs at the end, and housing prices are one of them. So this is showing the Case-Shiller housing price, the National Home Price Index, and it's not adjusted for inflation. You can see basically that housing prices in general fell after the Great Recession, and then they boomed, and then basically in the last couple of years they've skyrocketed. Interestingly enough, it's not an issue that we don't have enough housing. We do have enough housing. It's just not in the places people want to live, right? You can go to Detroit and basically buy an entire city block of houses, for very little money. But people don't want to live there because there aren't jobs there. And so we don't have houses in the right places. And we tend to build really big houses because that's where the incentives are for developers. Now, having said that, right, housing prices have gone up. I want to show you this next graph. And what this is trying to show you is basically the consumer price index just for housing going back to 2000. So the black line is the consumer price index overall, right? That's the inflation rate overall. The gold line is the inflation rate for housing, like if you're buying houses. And you can see that basically housing prices were rising faster than inflation up until the pandemic, right? So what I would argue here is that for the United States as a whole, higher housing prices were a real issue before the pandemic. And they've risen significantly, but not as fast as inflation overall. So they're not what's driving this particular bout of inflation. But now add to that rent, right? Instead of buying your house, the green line represents rents for a primary home. And you can see generally that is above the price of housing. So rental prices have gone up and been rising much faster. But once again, that's not what's driving the current bout of inflation. And then finally, the blue line, primary rents in the West, right? Rent for primary homes in the West. And you can see that in the West, where people want to live, housing prices have just been rising much faster than inflation, but again, up until the pandemic. With what we've seen basically in the last year or two, rents and housing prices are behind the curve. That is, inflation overall is higher than the price of housing going up. Now, if you live in Reno or Las Vegas or a few other cities, that doesn't give you much comfort. But nonetheless, I would say that housing is not what's driving this, but for many people, they were already in precarious position because rents have been going up so much before the pandemic that now it's like adding insult to injury. So how's that?
Yeah. Absolutely. We have seen in our own research here at BVP that we've been running research for folks that are out there. We do research along with communications. And, one of the things that we have seen is that the economy for a long time has been the number one issue for people. And recently housing affordability just kicked the economy's butt and is now number one issue for people. So that was a helpful explanation.
Well, I mean, but I don't know that it's much comfort, because
right.
People have seen their rents rise, right? Just because they didn't rise as much in the last year and a half as they had been doesn't mean that, or they didn't rise as much as gas prices and other things, doesn't mean that they didn't rise. And it's a big part of people's budgets. I live in Reno right now I'm in DC, but I live in Reno most of the time. And, it's real difficult for many people to find a house they can afford to live in.
Yeah, we have one of our staffers is in Reno. Our Northern Nevada manager lives in Reno, and that for her entire time that she's worked here, and it's been a few years, housing has been like the number one issue for people in Reno. It just seems to constantly be, I feel like Reno, at least for Nevada, was like at the forefront of the issue, and now the rest of the state is suffering in the same vein.
We pay way more for gas prices too. So
yeah. Oh my gosh.
We left there two weeks ago or so. It was 2.5 weeks. It was $6.25, I think, was the cost of gas in Reno.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot that we haven't gotten there yet here. That is with that that helps kind of bring everything full circle, housing and gas prices. The trend among this whole show was around how what is really to blame for inflation. We saw that it is not Joe Biden. He's not up there changing the gas prices. For a moment when you said, that there was on 420, the negative, I said, Joe Biden screwed up the minus sign.
No, but it was 420 of 2020. So.
But it wasn't him. It wasn't, we've gotten a great explanation. Thank you, Dr. Parker. I wanted to wrap up with this question for both of you, is that we talked a lot about how the media, in especially political opportunists, are taking people's fears and just running with it, people's legitimate fears, and running with it to, if it bleeds, it leads, to win elections, etc. So I wanted to start with you, Will. How can people best be media consumers and react to things, or receive information properly? How can they be really good media consumers? And if they see stuff and are having conversations with family, how can they sort of beat the disinformation or misinformation that they see?
Yeah, thank you. So for consuming media, I think the thing to be always constantly aware of is that there really is no such thing as a bias-free source. Everyone to some extent or another comes in with certain proclivities. I would argue that most larger mainstream media sources are typically more likely to have verifiable information due to the fact that they are governed by more strict editorial standards. Now, that isn't to say that everything they report is always true or always put in its proper context, but that is to say that you should evaluate things based on whether or not a claim is backed up by warranted reasoning and evidence that is convincing, and whether that can be replicated or whether that can be seen by other corroborating sources as well. If you're being exposed to things that are, less than middle of the road or maybe highly partisan one way or the other, there's a chance that you could be getting information that's filtered through a certain political lens, and that can lead to drawing some incorrect conclusions about certain things. Another thing to be aware of too is just fallacious reasoning in general. Many of the examples I kind of talked about with Fox News and Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk and those groups, a lot of times what they do is talk about things that are associated with one another, or that they are trying to associate with one another, but are not necessarily caused by one another. For example, to say that Biden supporting transitions away from fossil fuels means that he must be behind the increase in gas prices is kind of a ridiculous statement, because you would have to prove that some action that the president took influenced that somehow, and that his agenda is directly leading to that. So it's helpful to always be skeptical of any media that you consume, but also not to simply assume that something is true just because it is contrary to maybe what you perceive to be a prevailing narrative. And one of the things that I've really learned, and I've tried to impart on some of our staff here, that when it comes to misinformation and disinformation too, is that it's important to understand some of the underlying causes of why people believe that stuff and get tied up in those rabbit holes and wind up believing in nonsense. And a lot of it does have to do, again, with the phenomena of feeling frightened, not knowing necessarily the cause of the problems that they're experiencing, looking for a scapegoat or someone to blame, or at least an easy explanation that provides a psychologically satisfying narrative. And I think what's important to emphasize, as I kind of transition to the second part of your question, is that it's important to emphasize with people that, with our media landscape, 24/7 news and access to news through things like Twitter and social media and things, you're always being communicated with and manipulated to some degree. And to argue that, MSNBC is biased, but here's this blog that I found called patriottruth.com or whatever, and this says that this is true. It's like you should be equal, you should also be very skeptical of the stuff you're hearing from the other side too. And then when it comes to what to emphasize and how to talk to your neighbors and other people around this, especially people that maybe are sympathetic to the progressive movement and support it, but maybe are feeling kind of dejected right now and disenfranchised and struggling with their identity and their, willingness maybe to vote in 2022 even, is that, again, emphasizing some of the facts that Elliot has covered tonight, which is that the pandemic created a unprecedented economic crisis that we're still kind of just coming out of. And couple that with the war in Ukraine, there are factors that are not necessarily in direct control of the president. Of course, he can influence those things, but these are circumstances that were extant, before he was in office, and that are continuing to this day. Another thing to emphasize too is that you have to realize that the American Rescue Plan and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act were necessary in order to bolster the United States and its people in the wake of said economic crisis. When you think about the American Rescue Plan, for example, you had money that was sorely needed for state and local governments and municipalities for many different public amenities that a lot of people sometimes take for granted, especially here in Nevada, where we don't have a state income tax. The American Rescue Plan has allowed for Governor Sisolak, for example, to invest that money into things like affordable housing, childcare, and broadband internet and things of that nature. I think, too, that when you have these discussions, you have to also be frank with people and acknowledge that, this is a real pain for people that are in a position where they do have to take a long commute or are living paycheck to paycheck. You don't want to dismiss these concerns or these problems or these fears as illegitimate, because they're not. They're very, very real.
Absolutely.
And but what you also then need to pivot towards is, first of all, defining that, the culprits of this are the rich and powerful, the billionaires, the people that Joe Biden and Democrats in the Senate and Congress are trying to raise taxes on in order to help counterbalance some of these effects. They have legislation to do that. And I think we have a day of action coming up very soon where we'll be talking about the need to tax billionaires and corporations in a way that's equitable for people that actually work for a living. And realizing that while it may be misleading to lay the blame for inflation solely at corporate price gouging, it's also important to recognize that we are still in this fight against the same greedy corporations that we've been in the struggle with now for decades in this country, centuries really. And also pointing out the fact too that there is a substantial movement towards worker power in this country happening right now. It's not getting as much coverage as inflation, but unionization efforts at big companies like Starbucks is taking off all over the country. There's little pockets of union organizing happening all around, demanding better wages, better working conditions. All of that is also a way to counteract inflation, if you think about it, because more money in the pockets of people means that, inflation isn't as serious of a consequence for regular working people. And I think you have to then propose the vision that, this is the Biden agenda that he's highlighted since he was running for office, when he took office in the State of the Union, which is that we need to tax wealth like work, and we need to continue to create good paying jobs, support workers and working families, and making it easier for them to succeed by extending things like the child tax credit, making it permanent, et cetera. These are all things that are on the agenda. And yes, they're being gridlocked by a couple of members of Congress who refuse to play ball. But, the solution isn't apathy. The solution is continuing to engage. And it's not, I hate the phrase, just remember to go vote, because yes, voting is important, but there's more to do too, which is communicating effectively about this stuff. We here at BBP are always putting out communications and different materials and toolkits and social media, educating folks. This show tonight is designed to educate folks about this really important and complicated issue that I still don't fully understand either. But the point is that this is a resource, not just for the choir that, are our followers, but share this with your friends and family too. Invite them to ask questions and think critically about this stuff. And that is how we build a public awareness for things like restructuring our tax system in a way that favors working families and makes the wealthy pay what they owe. And so I'll leave it there. I'm sure Elliot has thoughts on it too, but that's my biggest plea for everyone in the audience tonight, is really dig into these issues, even if you're not an economics major, and understand where this is coming from and understand the vision to move us all forward.
I want to add just a few things to what Will said, because certainly what you said about media consumption is very important. I'm old enough to remember when there were 3 news channels, and it was pre-Reagan, and it was before the Fairness Doctrine was eliminated and before cable TV and specialized channels took over. And, Will's point was that, all media has a bias. And yes, one of the biases, even of those who have good editorial standards, is they want people to read their paper or watch. They need the consumers, right? And so they were more likely to do, try to have news that excites you and makes you read. And Facebook does the same thing in an extended way. They want you to be mad about things, right? They try to find ways to make you outraged. And the madder you are and the more outraged you are, then the more clicks they get and the more money they make. But having said that, having Walter Cronkite come on and say it, and we all heard it, right? Pat Moynihan used to say you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And we're in a world right now where basically the right-wing media has making up their own facts, right? They're entitled to their opinion. I'm happy to discuss those opinions in debate. I am not willing to discuss facts in the same way. I'm just going to try to lay them out there. And so part of it is, as a consumer, right? If everybody has bias, the one thing I want to say is get out of your echo chamber, right? The right wing does this. I don't think people on the left tend to do this as much, but I think they tend to do it some. That is, we all want to listen to people who agree with us. And I don't mean you should go watch Fox News, because that'll just make your brain bleed out your ears. But read different sources, right? Credible sources. Read foreign newspapers, right? British newspapers or German, and see what other people in other countries are saying, right? Get your news from many different places. And again, Will said credible sources, and I totally agree with him on that. Not patriotmovement.org or whatever the BS blog he was talking about.
Also, for foreign sources, maybe not Russia Today.
Well, like I said, credible sources, right? So, and then his other part is, how do you communicate it, right? That's our challenge. You know, how do you communicate it when the story you tell is a little more complicated, right? And people don't always want to put the time in, but at some level, you're respecting people by treating them as intelligent and saying, I think you're smart enough to understand that this is a more complex story than Fox News likes to tell you, right? That there are multiple causes, and that these things are not as simple, as we have. But we have this human tendency to get into tribal politics and see everybody we disagree with as somehow evil, right? And then we join together because we don't like somebody else, not because we agree with people, right? So again, getting out of our echo chambers is really important. Treating people with respect and assuming they're intelligent enough if they can just find the time to understand complicated issues.
That is a perfect way to close it out. Get out of your echo chamber and do what the professor says. Do what the doctor says. Thank you so much, Dr. Parker. Thank you so much, Will. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor Kate Marshall, for your cameo. Everyone loved it, and we all miss you here in Nevada. I hope this was helpful for everyone watching. Feel free to go back and listen to it, where we keep these shows saved on our Facebook and our YouTube pages. So you can go back, share with your friends, and hope you learned something. And I hope you take especially what Will and Dr. Parker said here at the end, to heart, because little things that we all do can change the way we communicate and the way people understand this information. So don't be afraid to talk about this issue at the next family dinner table and say, no, I have screenshots that Dr. Parker says Biden's not. The New York Post is wrong. You're quoting that. You're quoting the incorrect source, because that's incorrect. Thanks again, everyone, that participated. Thank you to all the staff that pulled this show together in a short week. It was a short week this week, and we put out on a great show for everyone. And I did want to say happy birthday to Brenda. It's a little bit of an inside joke. Happy birthday, Brenda. So I hope everybody watching this can say happy birthday, Brenda, in the chat. I won't go into the
happy
inside
birthday,
joke.
Brenda.
One day we'll say it, and happy birthday, Brenda. And she put this show together. I hope we did right by our producer, Brenda, and I hope Annette, who was not supposed to be watching, but she was watching, she appeared in the chats. I hope she has a safe trip tomorrow and stays vacationing, because she deserves a nice, good rest before the electoral cycle this year. So thanks once again. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you next week.